In this video, I'd like to discuss table audit stamps and data macros. Now, a data macro is essentially a trigger that you find in enterprise-level relational database management systems. And a trigger, or in the case of Microsoft Access, a data macro, is a piece of code that runs in response to a particular table event, like before creating a record, after creating a record, and so on. So once the specified action occurs, the piece of code that you specify would execute. So we'll go ahead and provide an example of that. In this case, I will create a table, and we can make this table store employee names. So I'll go ahead and call the table employee. So the primary key in this case will be employee underscore ID. And we can make it an auto number. And the next column can be the last name, and then the next one, first name. And that's all I will store for the employee, because this example is going to be focusing on audit stamps. So for the first audit stamp column, we will create a column called created date, and the default value for this will be now. Then I will create a created user column. Then I will create a modified date column, and the default value for this will be now. And I will create a modified user column. So what are these columns for? The created date column will be for creating the date and time for whenever a record is created. So that column will let you know when any particular row in the table is created. The created user column will store the username, the operating system username of the person who created that particular row. The modified date column will store the date and time that any particular row was modified. So if we change the last name or change the first name, this modified date will change and tell us when that particular row was modified. And the modified user will store the operating system username of the person who actually changed the record. I'll go ahead and turn the sub datasheet name to none, and I'll go ahead and save the table and name it employee. So here's the table. Now, to create the created user and modified user stamps, we need to have a function that returns our username in the system. So to do this, we will need to write just a very small amount of code. So we will go to the Visual Basic Editor, and I will insert a module, and I'll just name this mod tutorial. And we can create a public function, and a function is simply a procedure that runs that returns a particular value. So I will say public function username as a string. That means this function will be returning a string value, and what it's going to return is the operating system username. So I'm going to say username is equal to environ username. Now, environ is a function that returns the operating system environment variable. In this case, we're passing it the username environment variable, so this will return the operating system username. And we can go ahead and test this out by going to the immediate window and typing question mark username. And here is the username on my machine, JRobney Tutorials. So now that we have this public user-defined function that returns the operating system username, we can use this in a data macro. So how do we use and create data macros? let's return to Microsoft Access and go to Design View. And we will go to Create Data Macros and go to Before Change. Now, we can first worry about the modified stamps. So I will say set field for the modified date. We will type modified date, and we will set the value equal to now. And for the modified user, I will say set field, say modified user, and I will type in the user-defined function that we created. I'll click Save and Close, and we could see what happens. If I were to say Smith John, you can see right here in the modified users, the system username was written to the modified user column, and the date changed. So you can actually see the milliseconds are a little bit different than the created date. So we don't currently have anything for created user, so we can go back into the table and go to create data macros. Now the created user is going to be just a little trickier, but it's still fairly simple. We'll actually have to do an if statement. And we're doing an if statement because we only want this value to be inserted anytime a new row is being created. So in this case, we will say if is insert equals true, then set field, and the name will be the created user, and the function will be the user-defined function that we created earlier. So we could just take a look at it. Now the created user you can see is JRobney Tutorials, and we didn't need to do a created date in that data macro because this is already set to a system date time function as a default value in the table, so we didn't need to do that. So we're essentially done. There is really just one more thing we need to do, and this is to prevent people from changing or deleting these values, because right now a user can simply backspace and delete the value for the created user or even the created date. They can change it if they want to, and we want to prevent that from happening. So to do that, we will go to our data macro, and we will go to another if statement. Now in this case, we want to see if the particular created user or created date is being modified or updated. So we will say if updated, and we will pass the name of the field. So we'll say created date equals true. And we also have to make sure that we say is insert is false, because if we don't specify that, it will assume that this is trying to run every time we're creating a new row, and we don't want that. We only want this to run when we are simply updating a row, not inserting. So we'll say and is insert is equal to false, and we will say set field created date, and in this case we want to retain the original created date value, so we will say old dot created date. And we want to do the same thing for the created user, so we'll say if updated created user equals true and is insert is equal to false, set field created user and we will set this to the old dot created user field. We'll say save and close. We can take a look at this. So I'll say Doe John, and you can see the values have been created. Now if I try to remove this value, it retains the created user. Likewise, if I tried to put a new created date in there, it changes the created date back to the original date. So this is just a bulletproof, sort of foolproof way of preserving your audit stamps. And the modified date by definition and the modified user by definition would always change no matter what you tried to change in the table. So if I tried to delete the modified user, it would just return the modified user because it has to display the person who is updating the record. So that finishes this tutorial. We talked about the audit stamps and we talked about data macros. There are a number of other things you can do with data macros, and in a future video I will discuss how to create an audit table, a completely separate dedicated audit table, and you can do this using data macros, and it's a very powerful concept. So we've discussed table audit stamps and data macros, and we showed an example. And please stay tuned for future videos, and thank you for watching.